As you guys know, we started off doing these oral histories through a grant out of the Kansas Humanities program, and myself and a couple other individuals went and got trained in um, documenting oral history through the Library of Congress, and I have been working on doing so since then. So I'd like to thank you for coming and being willing to come and share your story with us.
Okay.
Um, Now, if we need to take a break, get some water, need another bathroom break or something, just let me know. We can stop and get up and do that. There's no need to barrel through everything.
Okay.
Um, if you wouldn't mind, just tell me your full name and where you're from, and maybe a little bit about yourself to start off.
I'm Carl Snyder,
Mhm.
and I grew up in Carthage, Missouri. Went to high school there, and then when I graduated in '42, in 1941, when Pearl Harbor happened, I was working in a filling station that morning, and I called my dad and I said, "Did you hear what happened?" He said, "Yeah," and I said, "Well, I think I'm going to join the Navy." He said, "I don't think so. You're going to finish high school if they'll let you." And so I did. I finished high school, and then, along with four other fellows, I enlisted in the Navy. Took my training, basic in Great Lakes Training Center, and from there, I went to Norman, Oklahoma, and went through turret maintenance school and ordnance school, and uh, learned something about the turret maintenance and stuff like that. And then they were sent us down to Purcell, Oklahoma, for some hand-to-hand combat training. I spent a month down there with that, and then I was transferred to Fleet Air Wing 14 in San Diego. And I spent some time there. I don't remember exactly how long it was, but I did some training on the Norden bomb site at that time, and that was a highly secret thing at that time. So, but they had one mounted on a trailer, a tractor effect that where I was elevated about 10 feet off the floor and practiced using that site. And I was there probably 6 months. I can't remember exactly how long. And then I was assigned to VB 109 bombing squadron, patrol bombers. And this is Navy. And this patrol bomber 109 was a B-24. The Navy called them PB-4Y1s. And so we were training. We went into that. I was assigned to a crew there. And we did some flying out of there to get acquainted with the plane and so forth. Did a little bit of aerial gunnery training there, as I recall. And then seemed to me like it was November of '43, I went to, we shipped out to Hawaii. And from there, we spent a little over a month there getting our plane provisioned for combat, getting guns in place and outfitting our toolboxes and so forth. So, as I said, we spent a little over a month there. In December, then we went to the war zone, and we flew up to Apamama Island in the Gilbert Islands. Was my first base, and they told us if you when you get there, the first thing you do is dig a foxhole. And they had also told us that island was it was 400 miles to the nearest Japanese held island. So we were green country boys. We thought that was a long ways. And so we set up the tent first and got our camp set up. About 10 o'clock the very first night, the bombers came over and bombed that island, and we lost 2 planes that night. We quickly got busy and dug us some foxholes, I'll tell you. That was a scary thing because we had not ever experienced anything like that, of course. So then we flew out of there for probably 3 months, 2 to 3 months, and we were flying a patrol sector. It was a pie-shaped sector that we flew out about 6 hours out, then did a cross member, and then came back. Our flight was usually 8 to 10 hours. Sometimes it was 11. 1 hour. One flight I recall was 12 hours. But anyway, and for that they had to put in extra fuel tanks. But we moved from Apamama up to Kwajalein Island. While I was on Kwajalein, there was some shipping. On Apamama, there was some shipping in the lagoon there at Kwajalein, and they were going to go after that shipping. And the pilots had a briefing meeting, and there they were asked to supply one plane that would go in late behind the others. We were probably 5 miles behind the main flight. And because it was a surprise attack, they wanted us wanted a plane going in, and they asked for volunteers. And our pilot came back to the camp and asked our crew, told us what was going on, and wanted to know if they wanted volunteers, wanted to know if we would want to do that. So we volunteered to do that by late going in. And the probably 70 miles out from Kwajalein, we had to drop down right above the water to get below radar and over the horizon, and flew in that way. The whole flight did that, and they crossed over the lagoon. There was 8 planes, I believe, that went in over the lagoon and hit the shipping, and we came in then and got up, elevated enough to get over the treetops, and we were to go down the airstrip and lay a string of bombs down the airstrip. Our job was to keep the fighters on the ground so that they couldn't get up and engage our flight. And we were able to do that. We flew down the airstrip there at treetop level. So we were able to see the expression on those people's face along the side, and they were firing everything at us that they had, rifles, pistols, and then, of course, when we went over the end, the anti-aircraft stuff. So we managed to come out of there with quite a few holes. As we were leaving the island, one of our engines was shot out with we assume it was a 37 millimeter cannon, and we lost that engine. We went. We were supposed to rendezvous with the rest of the flight 10 minutes after we left the island. But when we lost that engine, the pilot told the navigator to set a course for home because we didn't have time to rendezvous. So we gained some altitude and headed directly back to our base. And we hadn't flown very far. I don't remember how long we flew on 3 engines when an engine on the other side of the plane had been hit, with an oil line had been hit, and so that engine developed, ran hot. We had to feather that engine, shut it down. So then we continued on, headed for, and with that happening, we started throwing everything we could get loose in the plane, throwing it overboard to lighten the ship. We still hadn't seen our island yet, and the pilot asked the mechanic for a reading on fuel, and he said, "Skipper, we've been on fumes for the last 10 minutes." So he said, "I can't get a reading on fuel." Well, soon after that, we sighted the island, and the navigator had brought us in directly looking down the airstrip. There was another plane trying to land ahead of us. It was a PBY, and we were coming in kind of on top of it thus. And we didn't have any radio, but they had what was called an Altus lamp, which was a spotlight with a trigger so that they could send Morse code. And the radioman got the attention of the tower and let them know that we had to come straight in. We couldn't go around. And they finally got that other plane out of the way, and we landed. Well, we didn't roll very far on the strip, maybe halfway, and the other two engines quit. So we had just barely made it in. The rest of the flight was already in there. Of course, they were on full power, and they had already landed, and they were all out there sweating us in. So we were really pleased to get on the ground again. About, 2-3 weeks later, I got a letter from my mother, and she wanted to know what was going on a certain date. And it was that night, that day and she said that she woke up in the middle of the night and impressed to pray for us, pray for me. And she shook my dad and said, "We got to get up, we got to pray." He said, "What for?" She said, "I don't know, Carl's in trouble." So they did. They prayed until they felt relieved, and they went to bed then. And so I got a letter soon after that, and she cited the date, wanted to know what was going on that date, that they had sensed a problem. And so it was that night that we got shot up pretty good that day. And so it was I think it was their prayers that brought us through. That was my first experience of having any kind of belief in prayer or anything like that, because I didn't go to church before I went into the Navy. And so that was an amazing thing. We had we left. That island was Kwajalein, and soon after that, I don't recall, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, they took that island and we moved our squadron up there, and we're based on Kwajalein. I don't know whether you've know about the Army plane, a B-24 that went down out there, and it was called, I've forgotten the name of it now. But anyway, this crew went down in this plane at sea, and they were on a life raft for 47 days. So they finally were picked up, and they were picked up by Japanese and taken to that Kwajalein Island. At that time, it was Japanese held, of course, and they had some really rough time there. But and then those fellows were finally sent to Japan, then to prison camp. Anyway, that's an aside from what that's just kind of incidental to what to our own situation, but that's the island that we went to then when we moved up. We patrolled out of there for about 2 months, I guess. And then the U.S. took the island of Eniwetok, and we moved up to Eniwetok then, and did a lot of patrolling out of there. Our our tour of duty there in overseas was in the war zone was, I think, 8.5 months, and we flew every third day. We would fly one day, service the plane the next, stand down one day, and go the next. So it was a rotation. There were 17 planes in our squadron. So, but anyway, we lost about 3 planes, shot down by the Japanese. Fortunately, our plane was, though it was hit pretty heavily that day, we didn't have any more problems really. So let me get a drink here.
Mm-hmm.
When we left there, after doing our patrolling out of there, we went to Saipan and escorted some officials up there that they were getting ready to Saipan had just been taken, and they were building setting it up for B-29s to come in, and that's 29, of course, was the plane that carried the big bomb over Japan, and they were preparing for that. We didn't know that at the time, but that was prep for that. On Saipan, it was a kind of a scary thing because our airstrip was rather short for a B-24. So, and at the end of it, there was about a 50-foot drop down to the ocean, a bluff there. And we had to take the plane back, so the tail assembly was hanging off one end of the airstrip and rev up to as far as tight as the engine would go. And it felt kind of like a slingshot as we took off. When we hit a certain place on the runway, we were committed to go. We couldn't stop from there on. And when we went off the end with the load, bombs and fuel, the plane would actually sink down. It was like we went off on a carrier, but the plane actually sunk down below the level of the airstrip. So that was a thrill every time we took off from there. But we spent some time there. I don't remember how long, but then we were relieved. Our squadron was relieved. We came back to the States. So, and then after a 30-day leave, I was assigned to an air base in Hutchinson, Kansas, training officers and crews to getting ready to go overseas from there. And so they asked us when we first got there, kind of wanted to know what kind of a job we'd like to have there on the base. Well, I had shot some skeet when I was before I went into the Navy, and there was a skeet field there. And I said, I saw a skeet field out there. Is there any chance of getting on that? And so he said, can you shoot? I said, yeah, I can. He said, how many targets can you break? I said, I don't know. I haven't had a shotgun in my hand for a couple of years. But I said, I think I'd probably be able to do 23, 24 out of 25. He said, can you do that? I said, I don't know. I think so. So this officer that was talking to us about that asked me, they had a bunch of guys sitting there wanting to know what assignment they would get, and he put them on hold, and he took me out to the skeet field. He was an enthusiast of skeet shooting, so we shot a round of skeet and he said, "You'll do." I broke 22 targets, and he said, "That you'll do." Well, I did that for a year, and I suppose I must have fired at least 100 rounds of ammunition most days while I was there. I was teaching officers how to shoot skeet, how to lead a target, and I don't know why that was the case for bomber pilots, because they didn't have anything to do with guns. But anyway, that was what was the reason that we were given. That's what we were doing. So that was an interesting episode. Then I was discharged from there. They took me back and I was discharged from Norman, Oklahoma. And that's pretty much ended my Navy career.
Let's go back here. B-24. Can you explain B-24 to us?
B-24 is a four-engine bomber, land-based, of course. So we were based on islands as opposed to being on a ship. But it is a heavier than air bomber.
And you were trained in the turret. You explain a turret, what a turret is to me.
A turret, our turrets had twin 50 caliber guns in them. I flew in the belly turret, which was a ball turret, a Sperry ball turret that hung down below the belly of the plane. We had, on the B-24, there was a tail turret, a belly turret, a bow turret, and a deck turret, which was up. The deck turret, the radio operator operated that turret because that was right by the radio equipment. I flew the belly turret because nobody else really wanted it, and I was in charge of ordnance, and so I took that turret. The turrets were operated with hand controls, like the joysticks such as you see on these TV games now, and the trigger was a button in the top of that joystick. You rock it to one side to turn in azimuth around that way, rock it the other way, and you go around the other way. Put it down, and the turret guns pointed down. The turret moved with the azimuth, but the elevation, the guns just moved. So actually, when the guns are pointed down, I'm sitting up like so, and I'm looking through a window about that big around with my gun sight pointing through that. I'm sitting up like that. The guns ran down alongside my legs, and the receiver, where the shell went off, was about here, about that close to my head. And when you first got in that turret, it was pretty frightening. I first got in it in San Diego, and there was no guns in the turret at that time. And so these portholes where the gun barrels went out were about a 2 to 3 inch diameter. When you came around into the slipstream, that made a terrible noise. So I recall when I first got in it, in the first place, I'm sitting with my feet out in front of me, and I'm kind of on my back when it's in stow position. So, and I took that thing around. I'd bring it about so far, and that noise would build up, and I'd bring it back, and I'd take it back, and I did that several times, and I went this way several times. Finally, I just shut my eyes, gritted my teeth, and jammed the controls to one side and went round and around and around. So I got kind of used to that noise. And but it was still kind of exciting to have, even with the guns in there, that you had that. You just had to get used to what it was. The other turrets operated much the same way as far as the controls are concerned. The bow turret was actually as it sounds. It was on the front end of the plane, and those guns. First of all, my guns and the belly turret, there was a cam that kept you from shooting any part of your plane. If you're around here and elevated as high as it'd go, you cream around you. If you didn't have that cam, you could shoot your wingtips or the lower side of your engines. But that cam brought your guns down and wouldn't let you do that. So that was an electronic turret. They were, and I raised it and lowered it with a little hydraulic pump. To lower it, I just opened a valve and the turret dropped down. But to raise it up, I closed that valve, and there was a little wobble pump, had a handle about that long, and you just pumped it back up into the plane. On the B-24, that turret had to be retracted into the body of the plane because the plane hung so low to the ground you couldn't land with it down there. On the B-17, that turret didn't have to retract because it rode high enough off the ground. As I said, the other turrets operated pretty much the same with electric engines and motors, and the guns elevated, and you swung the turrets back and forth. Of course, they didn't come all the way around. The belly turret and the bow turret, the deck turret, which was on top above the plane, were the only two turrets that would go 360 degrees in azimuth. So the B-24 had a 110-foot wingspan, 67 feet long, I think it was. I remember the wingspan very clearly, but I kind of can't remember the length of that body.
What guns did you have in that turret?
50 calibers.
50 cals.
Then there was a west hatch, the windows that opened up on the side of the plane back to the back, and there was a single 50 in there mounted on a stand where the fellow just stood on the deck inside the plane and operated that machine gun.
Did you have two in yours?
I'm sorry?
You have two in yours?
Yeah. Two guns in each of the turrets, and the single 50s on the side hatch.
So you're in the belly.
Yes.
So when you're describing this mission and you're flying out and you're taking fire, that's coming from below you, I'm presuming.
Yes.
Right? From the ground. So you're not in an ideal position right there.
I'm in an ideal position to strafe, and I was strafing.
I mean, as far as being,
we all were vulnerable.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was exciting, to say the least.
Yeah.
We knocked 5 planes out of the air that day that were trying to take off. So no plane got off the ground that day.
You're saying your mission was to keep the fighters on the ground.
Yes.
What did that entail?
It just meant we laid a string of bombs down the airstrip to tear up the strip so they couldn't use it. Mm-hmm. And those that were trying to taxi out to get on, we were strafing them. And I was able to bear on them the whole time because I was able to strafe coming into them, and then I turned my turret around and I strafed going away. Strafing is firing at the planes from the turret onto the ground.
Mm-hmm. So in November of '43, you got to Hawaii. Where in Hawaii were you in relation to Pearl Harbor?
I was at Pearl Harbor.
So you were at Pearl Harbor.
That's where we went in. and we were stationed at Kaneohe Bay, which is there on the island of Oahu.
So, and this is 2 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor, right?
It was
So what
attack
was
was
that like?
1941,
Mhm.
December 1941. This was, yes, I had been a year trying to get there.
So what was that like getting to Pearl Harbor? And I mean, was there still aftermath?
Oh yes, yes, there was. It by that time it had been kind of cleaned up, but there was still debris there. So
Was that an emotional experience seeing that for the first time?
yes, it was. It. I really don't have a lot of recollection except for the fact that we were on Kwajalein. I mean on Kaneohe Bay, and we had Liberty in Pearl, so we would go over what they call the Pali, the mountain, and that was an exciting trip because we usually rode a Kanaki bus, and there were stone bluffs where the road going up there was, of course, very crooked, and you come around a curve, and a lot of those buses were dragged aside on that stone. They were all marked up with paint from the buses. So it was an exciting trip, but coming back, going up wasn't so bad. Coming back was a little bit scary. But one of the things that kind of stood out in my mind was saw lots of signs. I can't remember Kepu. Kepu, that meant to keep out. And a lot of these people had those signs in their yards. That was odd to me to see those signs.
What was the morale like in Pearl Harbor at this time, 2 years later?
I don't recall that it was bad.
Mm-hmm.
As far as our crew and people were concerned, we were excited. We thought we were anxious to get over there. Didn't have to be there very long till we were anxious to get home too.
Yeah. So, how long was your total time in theater over there?
I believe it was 8.5 months.
8.5 months. So, you get out. You know, we call it ETS in the Army. I'm not sure what they call it in the Navy. But you get out. Your time's up. Now what?
I started trying to find a job. About, I guess, 6 months after I got out, I was thinking, I made a mistake. I should have stayed in. But anyway, yeah, I worked, and I worked for a year. In 1947, I started college, and I got married on June 2nd, 1947, and so we've been married for 71 years now. And but I went to Bethany, Oklahoma to school, and I got out from there, and I started doing carpenter work there while I was going to school, and then at the end of the junior year, approximately the end of the junior year, in June of 1950, we went into school down there in 47, fall of 47, and in June we had our first baby. So I laid out of school to pay hospital bill and stuff like that. There was no insurance or anything that day, so I continued to work in construction, and I came back to Kansas City, and I was working construction there, and I just got really disappointed in what the kind of atmosphere I was working in. So I told them I was going to do something else. Well, we didn't have any education courses at that time. I hadn't, and but we went and saw the superintendent of schools, and we got a job teaching school. But we had to take some courses, education courses that summer and that fall by extension, whatever. And so I taught for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, I became a principal, elementary school principal. I was a school principal for 17 years in 3 different schools. The first school I had about 400 students. The second school I had 980 students. And the next school I had 1,025, I think it was, and 18 buses that we had to transfer for school kids with. So that was a pretty good task. Then they asked me to do junior high. So I moved up to junior high in 1996. And did that for 2 years, and then there was an elementary school on the same campus, and they asked me to take that over too, and that principal left. So I had the elementary, I had all the way from kindergarten through the 8th grade. After about 2 years, we converted that junior high to a middle school concept. So, but it was still, I was still wearing 2 different hats because the elementary and the junior high operation is just different. And I'd be in one building, they were about 100 yards apart, the buildings. And I'd be in one building and somebody would come up in the other building. And I spent so much time going back and forth that I was able to convince them that summer to give me an intern to stay in the elementary building, and then she could call me if she had problems. So that was the way and I did that for 5 years. I spent 30 years in the education department, and I told my wife about 10 years before that, I said, I'm going to do this for 30 years, and then I'm going to retire. I'm going to do something else. And I did. I retired in 96, and sold real estate. I did that for 20 years. So I finally quit doing real estate when I was 83 years old. That's when I hung up and didn't do any more work.
Which occupation did you like best?
I think I enjoyed the elementary principalship, well, the principalship, until the last 5 years, and that wasn't very much fun. Discipline became a different picture, and but I enjoyed the real estate too. That was I had been in the Kansas Retired People's credit union, or not credit union, keepers retirement system all that time, and when I was teaching. And so I had a decent income coming from that. So I didn't have to worry about putting bread on the table. And people think that real estate, you get you're paid big money because they see that what the fee is to list it. But that has to be divided up between some different entities that are involved. So you can't really count on everything coming to you that right at first. So, but I was fortunate that I sold my first piece of real estate before I even got out of the office at school. And so I was able to kind of control how much time I spent at it. So if I'd been used to going to my office at about 7:30, and in the real estate, I'd get to the office about that time. Knew anybody there? I had the office all to myself. But I pretty soon learned that I could do pretty well control how much time I spent there. And you in real estate, you're pretty much at the beck and call of your clientele.
Mm-hmm.
You got to be available when they are available. So, but to say the same thing, to say at the same time, if I got fed up with everything at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I went home.
Yeah.
So that from that aspect, and I enjoyed real estate. I really did, and we did a lot of traveling while with real estate.
When you got out of the Navy, were you a petty officer second class?
I was a petty officer second class. Second class ordnance.
Mm-hmm. So you were an NCO.
Yes.
How do you feel like being a non-commissioned officer prepared you, or maybe changed you, or set the pace for your other careers, or the way you led your life after that?
I can't say that I ever really made that kind of a comparison. I always enjoyed meeting people and interacting with people. So I really don't know what influence my career as an NCO had to do with that, but I felt pretty confident in myself. I kind of had the attitude, if somebody else can do it, I can too. Whatever the task, if I put my hand to it, I could do it. Mm-hmm. And I pretty well did that.
As a parent or a husband, being in the military had any effect on that at all?
I really can't say it did. I think that the biggest influence on my life as a parent and as a husband was when I became involved in church and in the faith, accepted Christ, and this whole thing changed my whole attitude about who I was and what my responsibilities were. Yeah, I think that had more influence on me than the military did. In the military, I was trained to do a task. People have said, "How could you do that? How could you face the things you did?" And my attitude was that it was a job to do, and I'd been trained to do it, and you just did it. You didn't think about it. Or at least I didn't. In civilian life, you were thinking about it because you were the one making the decisions.
Well, the military, though, was connected to your call to Christ because
Yes.
of your first experience.
Yes. But at the time,
they're sort of related.
Huh?
They're sort of related.
Yeah. Well, at that experience, I really didn't have any idea what prayer was or what influence it might have. As a matter of fact, I got a letter from my mother before this. I got a letter from my mother. We were overseas, and she was telling me, but they had become Christians, mm-hmm. and she told me about tithing, and that they were giving 10% of their money. And I told my friends, you know, my folks have gotten in with some kind of a cult, and they're giving their money away, and they don't have it to give away. So I had no inkling of what it was all about. I've tried to be that generous with my funds and everything since then.
When you first got out, did you experience any sort of transition issues? Was it? I know you mentioned that you thought, you know, maybe you shouldn't have got out after about 6 months or so. Was it difficult to transition to being a civilian?
You know, one of the main things, and especially that first year when I was still in the Navy and in Hutchinson, Kansas, I'd be on Liberty, and a car would backfire, and I was hunting someplace to get in the hole. I had that kind of a sensation many times. There were times that I had kind of flashbacks. For example, and it was a while after, but I went through a CAT scan, and that when those cameras clicked, it sounded like a machine gun, and that kind of bothered me. But it wasn't. It brought that to mind. But anyway, other than getting accustomed to different noises in civilization, if you will, we went to Florida and went through a museum down there, and they had a B-17 set up to simulate a flight and a bombing run. I went through that, and when you were in that bomber, they had sound effects. It sounded like the engine running. The bomb bay doors were open, and that took me back because of the open bomb bay doors and the gunfire, and they were talking back and forth talking about the plane, where the planes were coming in from. So that night I dreamed about that. So it was, and then more recently, I don't know what triggered it, but I did another bomb run. So that was, I woke up and it was a little hard to go back to sleep. But as far as messing with my head, I didn't experience that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really think that I experienced some of the things some of these guys who are in Iraq now and stuff like that. I didn't experience anything in that nature. Mm-hmm. The IEDs and stuff like that.
When you go on vacation, do you ever ask them if you can ride down in the belly just for old time's sake?
No. As a matter of fact, they had B-24 come through here last year, the year before. Well, it was costing, I think, $350 for about a 15-minute ride, and I said, why would I want to do that? In the first place, I couldn't get into one. Mm-hmm. I weighed about 170 pounds at the time I was flying in it. And I filled the turret up. Mm-hmm. I was about 5'10", and weighed 170, so it was a full turret. Mm-hmm.
Those the people you served with, did you keep in contact with them over the years?
Yes. 50 years later, after in 1997, I got a call. This fellow, and I hadn't seen or talked to in 51 years, and they were having a reunion of the squadron that relieved us and our squadron in Arizona. And I went to that. And after that, every year, until 3 years ago, I stopped going. But every year we had a meeting of that group of guys, or as many of them as could make it. I helped sponsor. We would have our reunions wherever the person that was sponsoring it, where they could handle getting the preparation.
Mm-hmm.
So I sent. I spent 3 times down in Branson having it there, but we went in different places. We went to Pensacola 2 times. We went to Washington D.C., to Beaufort, South Carolina, and different in Las Vegas a couple of times. So, yeah, we met. I think the largest group we had of crew members was like 40 members. The last one I went to, there were 5 of us. And they had died off or just got to the point where they couldn't travel.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reason I stopped going, because it was just too difficult to get there,
yeah.
Fly and so forth. So that was a very enjoyable thing.
Mm-hmm.
And their families would come, of course, and so we would have sometimes 60 or 70 people there because of family interaction also.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the last 2 years, it was family members that actually sponsored we, because most of us old-timers are just not capable of doing what it took to get it all together. But it's kind of difficult to call everything to mind.
Mm-hmm. Like,
It's not something I'd want to do again.
yeah. Yeah. I know that feeling. Well, I really appreciate you coming down here today and sharing your story with us. It really means a lot.
Thank you for asking.
I,
You might ask him about what a typical, they have 2 days off.
mm-hmm.
Why don't you have him run through what those days are like?
Down days. So you had the 1 day on, 2 days off.
We usually played poker or something like that. And one day I was on. We had to have somebody at the plane all the time,
mm-hmm.
and we were. I was on plane watch at what we were there for was just really to surface it and be sure that nobody took stuff off of it or stuff like that. But anyway, I was there one day and my co-pilot came by, and I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going over and check out an SBD." He said, "I haven't flown a stick job for a long time. I want to take one up. You want to go with me?" And I said, I don't know. I got to stay here with the plane. He said, "Oh, they'll watch it." Said he pointed to the guy next to the next plane. He said, "Grab your helmet and your oxygen mask and just go." So I went with him. And he got up. I don't know how high he was, probably 10,000 or so. He said, "Have you got that seatbelt fastened good?" And I said, "Yeah." About that time, he flipped it over on his back and down, straight down. I'll tell you, it was something else. I had never had anything like that, and he got a big kick out of that. But when he pulled out, he I felt like I was going through the seat. But that was an experience. Another time when I was on Saipan, I had to plane watch at night, and so I set up a cot underneath the wing and went to sleep, and which was nothing wrong with that, except they came to move that plane during the night, and I didn't wake up. And I woke up the next daylight, and I was looking at the sky, and the guys came around with that tractor that they moved planes with. I said, "What happened to the plane?" He said, "It's over in the revetment over there." I said, "Why didn't you wake me up?" He said, "I did. I tried to. I put my bumper against your cot and pushed it, and you didn't wake up." So they just left me there. I got in a little trouble over that. Oh my!
What's an SPD?
That's a dive bomber.
Mm. Does that stand for something?
Yeah, it's the bomber dive is the BD. S is the manufacturer.
Ah, okay. Did you get to get out on the town or anything when you were overseas? Did you ever?
There wasn't any town. There were some natives there, some of them. Well, on the first one, but that's the only one. The rest of them had been shot up so badly, it was just military people there then. And of course, we got out in Hawaii when we were there. When we first went on Apamama, they were just natives on there. And everyone wore a grass skirt. Men, women, girls, boys, everybody had a grass skirt. That took a little getting used to, but after about, maybe 2-3 weeks, they all looked alike.
What was the culture? What was in Hawaii? What was that like? And not necessarily the military so much, but the civilians. Were they scared? You know, I mean,
No,
they had to have been impacted by Pearl Harbor
I
as
don't
well.
know that if we weren't aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
At least I wasn't. Now, when we got on Apamama with those natives, they didn't have any means of barter or anything. They no need to, because what one had, they all had. They lived on the land and on the sea. They lived on squid and whatever, fish or whatever, and breadfruit and all different kinds of fruit that they grew there on the island. But when we got there, we would get those native girls to wash our clothes for us. We had bars of saltwater soap, and they washed those with that. And after they washed our clothes for us, we'd give them one of our skivvy shirts or something like that. Well, we were there probably a month, maybe. They didn't want that old handoff skivvy shirt. They wanted money, so they could go to our PX and buy what they wanted. So that changed from there. But we used to give them cigarettes or something like that to have them go up a palm tree and get a coconut for us. But that was the culture there, was just what one had, they all had. And
Was there any animosity between the natives and the
no
military?
animosity, but there was strict rules that there was no fraternization.
Really?
If you guys got in trouble for a little bit of that. When we came back to the States, on the way back through Hawaii, they put us up in our squadron in the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. And that was That was quite an experience. The hotel was pink, and it's still pink today. But as I recall, we paid 25 cents a night to stay there, each of us. And we were able to tell the cooks what we wanted, and how we wanted our eggs, and all that stuff. That was high living.
Yeah. Have you been back to Hawaii since?
Yes, yes. We bought a condo. I bought a timeshare condo over there, and so my family, my wife and I, went back over there 11 out of the 12 years and we gave it up 2 years ago, or well, 6 years ago. I gave it to my daughter and son-in-law. They also had one on another island. They had one on Kwajalein. Ours was on the big island of Hawaii. So, an interesting aspect of our marriage, the year that we were married, our 50th wedding anniversary, we went somewhere every month, my wife and I. Made quite a deal out of going somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And in the summertime, we took my daughter and her husband and my son and his wife to Hawaii with us. And my son-in-law and I played golf. My son went fishing, and he caught a 183-pound marlin. So that was quite an experience.
It's a big one.
Yeah. He got pictures of it, but it was too big to bring home for sure.
Yeah. What'd you do with it? Release it?
I don't know what to do. I suppose they ate it. People there. I caught a trophy-sized mahi-mahi, a bull-nosed dolphin, and I had it mounted. It was over my fireplace at home. But it was really just a styrofoam body. The only part that it was real was the eyes, and not the eyes, but the fins and the mouth. And all the rest of it was styrofoam and glass eyes. But that was a thrill.
Have you been back over to any area of the theater you were in?
No, I have wanted to go over there, but I haven't. I have read stuff about what the status is over there now, and it would be altogether different. It's more civilized and so forth. When we arrived at the second two islands, the last three, Kwajalein, Inuitak, and Saipan, they were all really shot up, and all the palm trees looked like telephone poles. All the foliage was knocked off from shelling and so forth. The first island had never been hit because the Japanese hadn't occupied it, I don't believe. But anyway, it had all the palm trees, and the beaches were beautiful and stuff like that. When we went on Kwajalein and Inuitak especially, the dead bodies that had not been buried, you could smell the death and everything there. That was kind of it kind of bothered you.
Yeah. That the first thing that hit you when you got there?
Yeah.
That and the smell of bombs?
Yeah.
Yeah. You didn't ask him if you could just stay on that first island?
I'd love to stay
Enjoy
there.
the palm trees?
We came back there for an engine change after, on June the 6th of 44, we came back to there for an engine change overhaul. that we were on there when the Battle of the Bulge took off.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful place.
So, how much word were you getting during this time frame of what was going on in the European theater? Were you guys
Not much.
not much?
Not any. No, we really didn't know beyond the fact that the Battle of the Bulge took place, the invasion. The invasion was what was on the 6th.
Mm-hmm.
And so we heard about that, but we heard, of course, we heard when Roosevelt died.
So you're not getting a lot of information whether we're winning or losing or what's going on.
No, we didn't have any idea. It wasn't like it is today, because even if we wrote letters, they were pretty well cut up. If you said the wrong thing, they censored everything. So we weren't allowed to tell them where we were or anything like that. A lot different than it is today with Skyping back and forth to the theaters.
Mm-hmm. Were you getting supplies consistently? Feeding
Getting
you
what?
Supplies? Were they feeding you? And
We ate a lot of not K rations, but C rations,
mm-hmm.
and had a lot of spam. In fact, I told when I got home, I said I don't want to hear the word spam.
Mm.
We ate it every way you could fix it, I think. In fact, I'm hearing some on television now about making hash out of it or something. I don't know.
There's a new spam craze out there. I don't know what that is either.
I didn't need that.
Yeah. Were they getting you bullets and parts though, pretty regularly?
Getting what?
Bullets and parts?
Yeah,
Keeping your vehicles up?
yeah.
Yeah.
We had a little trouble getting gun barrels for the.
For the 50s?
If you held that, you had to fire in short bursts.
Melt that barrel.
If you didn't, you burn the barrel, burn the riflings out of your barrel. And we had several of our guys that get excited and just hold that trigger down, and they finally the tracer would come out of there doing a wobble.
Were they Brownings?
Yeah. Why? I'm not sure what they were.
Butterfly grips?
No.
No.
No, these were electronically fired. Well, now the side hatch was butterfly, but the others were fired electronically.
Mm-hmm. That's right, because you were firing from your joysticks.
Yeah. We went on a couple of high altitude hops above 20,000. And the first time we did that, the gun would fire one time and stop. Couldn't get them to automatic. Find out that the lubrication on the bolt was stiff and it wouldn't let it slide all the way back and forth. So if we were going on the high altitude deal, we had to dry those bolts off so that they were dry and would slide in the action.
Huh.
That was an interesting thing. Above 20,000, above 10,000 feet, really, it's pretty cool up there.
Mm-hmm.
And we weren't flying in heated suits or anything, just in dungarees, jeans, and that was. My legs would get stiff, my knees didn't want to bend hardly when getting out of there.
They didn't have heaters in there for you, huh?
No, and we didn't have any ear silencers. No, those guns were going off about right here, beside my head, and alongside my legs. But the receiver was about right here, and I think that has affected my hearing today.
I'd say them 50 cals are pretty loud.
Yeah. Some of it is dissipated out into the atmosphere, but it's still kind of loud in that turret.
Uh-huh. Yeah, because the chamber's inside with you, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And is that that turret's mostly closed off except for where the barrels go through and your aiming
Oh,
point,
it's
right?
totally closed. In fact, my turret was some kind of cast iron, I think. It was, the whole thing was solid except for that window. And that window was about that thick. So if bullet hit it, it didn't penetrate.
You ever hear any bullets bouncing off your turret?
On that run down the high runway I did, I'm sure they were those pistol bullets and stuff like that they were firing. Because they were firing everything they could get out. They were alongside the runway. And it was something else.
I'd imagine. How were the guns fed? Were they belt fed?
Yes.
Belt fed?
Yep.
Yeah, would you have a loader or were they how many rounds would
I don't recall how many rounds was loaded in there, but they were in a can,
Mhm.
and it fed through.
But so I mean I imagine you went through quite a few rounds in that run.
Yeah.
Did you have to reload at some point?
What's that?
Did you have to reload at some point
Not on that run.
on that run? So that
No, you didn't. You didn't reload till you got back to base.
so it holds quite a few rounds then.
Yeah.
Uh
Seemed me like those guns would fire 1,200 rounds a minute,
yeah.
and every fifth bullet was a tracer, and every fifth bullet was armor piercing, and the others were ball ammunition. So when you were firing, you had a tracer going out every fifth bullet.
Mm-hmm.
And we tried to fire. I tried to fire at least about 5 at a time, because some of those guys came back with their barrel rifling shot out of their barrel, and we had a hard time resupplying barrels.
And plus if, you burn out that barrel then you don't have much aim.
Mm.
So you're kind of
Well, you don't have any
defenseless
trajectory.
yeah.
It's just they come out and just.
So what if there was a weapons malfunction?
What's that?
What if there's a weapons malfunction? How much do you have much space in there to perform any remedial?
I could jack the open manually, but I couldn't take them down or anything.
Could you break the chains and pull it back
No.
across if you needed to, or
No, it was housed.
I was housed? Did it happen very often that there was a weapons malfunction?
Only when the main place, we always test fired our weapons before we hit the attack zone. So soon after we took off from the base, we would fire a test round, test burst. And so if there's anything wrong, then I could work on it. I was the lead ordnance on the plane. So no, we didn't have many times that happened. The main thing was, like I said, when we went high altitude, they just wouldn't automatic
Mm-hmm.
if they were oiled.
How many runs did you do?
We flew, oh, how many runs that day? One run down that airstrip
No, I think you meant altogether.
altogether. We went out every third day. We'd fly one day, stand down, service the plane one day, and stand down one day. So every third day we were flying,
Quite a few.
and our flights were from 8 to 12 hours. I think we only had one flight that was like 12 hours, but we had several that were 10 hours. But that's flying a sector, flying out across sector and then back. It was interesting. While we were over there, we were instructed to keep our eyes peeled for, what was her name? That the gal that they went down and trying to fly around the world.
Oh, Amelia Earhart.
Yeah. Never did see her.
No.
I think they finally decided that she went down near one of the islands or something.
Mm-hmm.
Amelia Earhart, yeah.
Huh. What year was that, Amelia Earhart?
I think it was in 39 or something, right about that.
Interesting. Was that like an official thing, or were you guys kind of joking around about that?
No, well, I don't know. We just got word to keep our eye peeled.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether it was started facetiously or not. I know for a long time they were searching for her.
Uh-huh. Did you encounter any air-to-air combat?
We didn't.
No.
Just that time when we went over our particular crew. Now, some of our planes did, but we never were attacked.
That one big run you had, did they have planes in the air at the time?
No.
They didn't get any off the ground either.
They didn't get anything off the ground. And we shot 5. Well, some were trying to take off. We shot them down before they really got altitude.
Mm-hmm. And those carried bombs too, right? Your B-24s?
Oh yeah.
Did you
We
get part of any bombing missions?
Yeah. The two high altitude hops we had were bombing missions from that high, but they determined that we were more effective down low.
Mm-hmm. What size bombs they carry? Mark 84s or
350s, 500s.
Mm-hmm. One
trip we carried 1,000-pounders, but most of the time we were carrying 350s looking for shipping.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the B-24 carried a heavier bomb load than the B-17 did. Had one occasion where the bombs we tried to release didn't go. I had to go out there was a track about that wide that went from across the bomb bay and out where the bomb racks were fastened to. And I had to go out there and get that bomb loose. So we didn't want to land with it because the shackle had already been released. So that was kind of a thrill too.
Yeah.
Out there over that open bomb bay.
Mm-hmm. Little windy?
Little windy. Noisy.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Well, one of our trips down in Florida, Pensacola. Our bus driver was one of the guides that went through the museum with us, and he said he told us about these two Marines that got lost in the jungle when they hid out in the jungle, I guess. Anyway, when the Japanese took the island over, they were there several weeks. I can't remember exactly how long, but it was a month or more, and they just got along on what they could find there to eat, plants and I guess bugs, whatever they could find to get to eat. And when they finally found them, and they brought them out, he said he showed a picture, and they were just skin and bones. But these two guys, and he said, if you look up there, a picture up on a certain floor in this museum, he said, there's two of them up there. I'm one of them. So he was telling us about his experience of being in the jungle.
Yeah.
It's a whole different ball game now as far as the bombs are concerned. They lock on to a target 5 miles out and release it and turn the head for home.
Yeah.
We were over top of it.
Shooting in the turret, all that brass go out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Doesn't pile up in there, I'd imagine.
No, it's spilled out.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to sit on 50 cal shells. Those are hot. I've caught a couple down the collar.
Right.
They leave scars.
Yeah.
They're hot and they're
Yeah.
loud.
Did you wear a parachute when you were in there, or did you have any room?
Had a parachute in the plane, never did put it on. We were flying too low most of the time to worry about a parachute. Actually, we patrolled probably at 3,000 to 5,000 feet. But when we made any attack, we were down at masthead.
Did you get into that turret from the top of it, from
Yeah.
the plane side?
Yep.
You didn't crawl in from underneath.
No. Oh, I got in after we were airborne.
So it was sealed off in underneath then. I mean, as far as there's not like an exit or
Not like what?
there's no way to exit that then, except for coming up into the plane.
No.
Take some food down in there with you.
No.
You go.
I took chewing tobacco. Couldn't smoke in there.
So the 10-hour rides, you weren't eating or drinking?
Well, we could come out and do that.
Okay.
In fact, when we were just on patrol, I wasn't in that turret. I didn't ride in there all the time.
Okay.
I went in there when we made contact.
Is there somewhere to go to the restroom?
Yeah. We had a thing that looked like a lard can, about that big around, set up about that high, had a toilet seat on it. And we had a tube that went out, a funnel-shaped tube that went out the side of the plane to where you could urinate. But they had bags in that can. So you could use the bag and then throw it overboard.
That time you guys got shot up, you lost 2 engines,
Yeah.
and the other 2 died shortly after you landed. But how much damage did the rest of the plane sustain?
Oh, we had holes all over it.
Yeah.
And in fact, they patched those holes, and after they'd patch it, they'd use chromate to seal it. Our plane looked like a leopard.
A chrome leopard.
Yeah.
What was your?
But fortunately, nobody got hit.
Yeah, it is.
All the bullets that hit that plane, nobody took a hit.
When you got out of the plane and looked at it, what was your reaction?
Glad to be on the ground.
A little bit of shock.
Yeah. Yep.
You said you were in until 46. Is that when you came back? Were you overseas?
No, I came back in 45, but I was mustered out in February of 46, I believe it was.
Teaching them officers how to skeet shoot.
What's that?
Teaching them officers how to skeet shoot.
Yeah.
They were still doing pilot training in Hutch, weren't they, at that time?
Yeah. And they were they were checking the pilots out there mainly on. We had to fly at least 4 hours a month in order to get our flight pay, and so we would take one flight that would usually 4 to 6 hours, something like that, and but on those checkout flights, the instructor pilot on takeoff may reach over and cut an engine, and the pilot had to recover the plane. Well, that was kind of exciting, especially if you're in the back in the plane. You didn't know what was going on. Also, they would take it up and stall the plane, and they'd stall it to the point it just sit up there and hang like that, and they'd drop off. Well, we had my nerves were bad at that time. We'd had enough of that stuff. Anyway, we were flying off of Hutchinson at this time. And one time on one of those flights, I got it in my head that plane was going to crash. So when we were going down the taxi strip down to get into position to take off, I opened up the tunnel hatch and bailed out. Skinned me from one end to the other. But somebody in the tower saw it, and they radioed the pilot and told him he'd lost a crew member. Well, they picked me up in a Jeep and took me in. I had to go to captain's mast over that. And so I was sentenced to stay on base for a month. Lost my privilege to go on liberty.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about a week after I got that assignment, they came out with an announcement that they needed people to go to Jacksonville, Florida for turret maintenance training. So I thought that's a good idea. I'll volunteer for that. So I did. And I got to Jacksonville and I just got into the barracks. Hadn't been in there 20 minutes, I guess. And they called my name over the loudspeaker. Report to the master-at-arms shack. And I was still in the same Fleet Air Wing, so I had to serve my duty down there. I didn't get out of my jail time. Anyway.
Trouble followed you, huh?
Trouble followed me. An interesting follow-up of that, one time I ran into a guy here in Kansas City, and we got to talking about our experience, and he had been at Hutch. He said, while I was there, some old boy jumped out of an airplane going down the airstrip. I said, you're kidding. I never did tell him it was me.
Should have told him.
Oh, my.
Those were B-24s too?
Yeah. Yeah, they had a tunnel hatch back there that opened up, and I opened that thing up, and out I went. We were probably going 10 miles an hour or something like that. Wasn't very fast, but it was enough that I couldn't stay on my feet.
Probably wouldn't want to do it again.
No, no.
So you wanted to enlist because of Pearl Harbor, out of a sense of duty for your country. What did you take away from your experience when you came back?
Still a feeling of honor to have served. And I went back over there later, after we were married. I went back over there and I went through the Arizona, the one that's there as a memorial, and that was interesting. But it's kind of awesome too because there's no it's total silence on that memorial,
Yeah.
and it was that's kind of what it was.
Mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished.
Well, I really appreciate you coming down here today and sharing your story with us. It means a
Okay.
lot.
Thank you for asking.